Bible is full of stories that we all know and love. But how well do we know them? The answer might surprise you. The Bible you thought you knew is going to dive deep into the exquisite details of the biblical stories that make them fascinating and transforming. In this week's podcast, we're going to discuss two biblical characters that are more than unfamiliar. They are obscure in the extreme. If you know about these characters, you will be a champion at biblical trivial pursuit. These two characters even have the same name, Lamech. Though virtually unknown to people who think they have a pretty good grasp on the biblical stories, we learn about them from two strategic chapters in Genesis, chapters 4 and 5. The first 11 chapters of Genesis sets the stage for the rest of the biblical story. In those chapters, we read about creation, the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Noah and the flood, and the Tower of Babel and the like. One would think that we would have nailed down every single detail of that important passage. The two Lamechs have a role in this significant narrative. How is it that they remain so obscure? The answer to that question is quite simple. They are both part of genealogies, perhaps the most hated form of biblical material. No one likes genealogies. No one reads them. No one pays much attention to the people listed. No one thinks that the names, often odd and unpronounceable, add anything to the overall biblical story. Who cares that Uts was the son of Boots? Would anyone be in the least disappointed were genealogies eliminated from the biblical record? We might draw the line at Jesus' genealogies, one in Matthew and one in Luke, but that is about it. Other than that, the only genealogy we are even slightly interested in is our own. Yet this visceral negative reaction to genealogies notwithstanding, the two Lamechs are, after all, biblical characters, and they play important roles in the narratives of which they are a part. Let's take a look. The first man named Lamech appears in the genealogy of Cain, who famously murdered his brother. That story is in Genesis 4, 1 through 16. Cain, of course, killed Abel. The genealogy itself is found in Genesis 4, 17 through 24. The list is as follows: Cain, Enoch, Irad, Mahujael, Methushael, and then Lamech. But when the genealogy gets to Lamech, there is more detail involved than mentioning his father and then his son. We learn that Lamech had two wives, one named Adah and the other Zillah. Then Lamech's sons are mentioned. Lamech's wife, Adah, gave birth to Yabal, who we are told was the father of people who live in tents and have cattle. Another son by Adah was Ubal, who was responsible for people who play the lyre and the pipe, both ancient musical instruments. Lamech's other wife, Zillah, gave birth to Tubal-Cain, who knew how to forge bronze and iron instruments. Tubal-Cain also had a sister, Naamah. At this point, we realize that Lamech's children advanced culture considerably. People who lived in tents and engaged in animal husbandry were advancements. As well, musical instruments were now available to people. Of course, the ability to make tools made out of bronze and iron would improve living standards considerably. Cain may have been himself a murderer, but people descended from him contributed to what we might call civilization. So far, so good. Then we are treated to a little poem that Lamech recited to his two wives. Ada and Zillah, hear my voice. You wives of Lamech, hearken to what I say. I have slain a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. If Cain is avenged sevenfold, truly Lamech 70-fold. With that poem, nothing more is said about Lamech, but its content is startling. Right after we were feeling somewhat positive about Cain's family, in that it evidenced these cultural achievements, we are subjected to this strange poem, which seems to predict and brag about increasing violence. What gives? Keep in mind that Lamech was a descendant of his forefather, Cain. Cain had killed his brother to avenge a slight. God had accepted Abel's offering, but had rejected Cain's. Cain's offering was not accepted, not because of any wrong he had done, but because it had come from the ground, which God had cursed due to the sin committed by his parents, Adam and Eve. God had even told Cain not to take this rejection personally. If he could handle it, everything would turn out fine. But Cain ignored what God had said, and in a fit of anger murdered his brother, who obviously had done nothing to deserve this behavior. Cain's attempt at vengeance was completely bogus. Abel had not acted against his brother, had not criticized his brother, had not gloated that his offering was accepted, and simply gave an offering that made sense in the light of his occupation as a shepherd. Cain's cold-blooded murder had not exacted an ounce of vengeance, for Abel was completely innocent. I did a previous podcast on Cain and Abel and the fact that the cursed ground explains God's actions. You might want to review that one when you get a chance. This brings us back to the first Lamech. In his thinking, twisted thinking, we might add, Lamech quantified his ancestor Cain's attempt to avenge a perceived wrong. If Cain's effort at vengeance was sevenfold, how he came up with that number is a mystery, he, Lamech, had every right to avenge himself 10 times that number. Since Cain had murdered his brother, Lamech boasts ludicrously that he would do much more if someone even slaps or punches him. How does one increase murdering someone? Whatever Lamech had in mind, he seems to have believed that unrestrained violence would obtain if anyone slighted him in any way. It was a frightening poem that he recited to his two wives. Of course, we have no way of knowing whether Lamech carried out his promise of unrelenting violence because Cain's descendants did not survive the great flood that God caused to bring judgment on the earth. Given Lamech's prophecy, it is hard to lament the loss of this population group. The second Lamech occurs in a genealogy of Seth, the child that Adam and Eve had after Abel's death. Curiously, the people in this genealogy contributed little in the way of cultural advancements. Instead, they improved humankind in religious ways. For example, after Seth's son was born, we learn that at that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord. That was religious activity, perhaps prayer of some sort. That's in Genesis 4, verse 26. A man also with the name of Enoch was a descendant of Seth. That's in 5:21. This man, quote unquote, walked with God, suggesting a positive relationship with the deity. In fact, mysteriously, Enoch's walk with God was so positive that he is never said to have died, even though the death of each member in the genealogical list is mentioned as a kind of refrain. Somehow, Enoch avoided this. That's in 5, verse 24. Even though no one remembers the second Lamech, or the first one for that matter. His son is as famous as biblical characters come. He was Noah. As with the first Lamech, when the second one appears in a genealogy, more details are provided than listing simply a birth and then a death. We learn that when Lamech fathered a son, Noah, when he named the child, he had a little something to say. Here is what he said: "Out of the ground which the Lord has cursed, this one shall bring us relief from our work and from the toil of our hands." That's in verse 29 of chapter 5. Ground is a big deal in Genesis 1 through 11. It was the stuff from which God made the first farmer, Adam, and the animals. That's in verses 7 and 19 of chapter 2. In fact, God had made this first man out of the ground so that he could till this same ground. That's in verse 5 of chapter 2. This ground was to be the source of food for the human family. That is why it was so devastating that the ground was cursed when the man and the woman in the garden sinned. Food production was now going to be difficult. That's in verses 17 through 19 of chapter 3. Ironically, when we die, we return to the ground. That's in verse 19. Who does not remember those haunting words when we have ashes imposed on our foreheads on Ash Wednesday at the beginning of Lent? You are dust, and to dust you shall return. Of course, in Genesis, we have been made from, quote unquote, the dust of the ground. This is what makes the second Lamech's prophecy about his son Noah so incredible. The first Lamech predicted that the world would be a much more terrible place were he to have his way. The second Lamech predicted that the curse on the ground would either be greatly lessened or removed altogether due to what his son would accomplish. As it turned out, the second Lamech's prophecy came true. After the great flood, which Noah, his family, and a representative from each group of the animal community survived on the ark, Noah made an offering to God. God liked the offering and made an announcement by saying, "I will never again curse the ground because of people, for the human imagination is evil from their youth." That's in verse 21 of chapter 8. That was great news, but not its full extent. God went on to point out that destruction on this scale would never happen again. Plus, from now on, the conditions for agriculture would remain in place. Quote, "Seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease." That's in verse 22 of chapter 9. In short, agriculture would remain a constant for humankind in perpetuity. On reflection, the two Lamechs should not be all that obscure. The first one was a nasty character, promising only mayhem and violence should someone cross him. His group did not survive the flood. The second one promised that Noah would do more than survive the flood. He would have a hand in rendering the ground either less cursed or not cursed at all. Bless Lamech, the father of Noah, a man most have never heard of, though his contribution was incalculable. So the stories of the first two Lamechs, and the only two Lamechs in the Bible. Go to my website when you get a chance. Let me know what your email is so I have a chance to contact you. If you have a question that you would like me to answer in a subsequent question and answer session, go to me at fspina106@gmail.com. Thank you.
I want to thank you so very much for listening to The Bible You Thought You Knew. I have a question for you. Do you have a question or topic that you'd like me to cover on the podcast? If so, all you need to do is head over to Apple Podcasts and do two simple things. One, leave a rating and review telling me what you think of the podcast. Two, in that review,
Ask anything you want related to the Bible. That's all you have to do. Then, listen in to hear your question answered on a future episode. Join us next time on The Bible You Thought You Knew when we discuss Jesus' personal Bible. God bless.